so we go from toolkits around being able to drive access and equity through this ability around inclusion and making sure that everyone is on the same page when it comes around to not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk with inclusion, to adherence and medication adherence in clinical trials. Because when we think about access and we think about equity in healthcare, a big part of that equation is around the ability to make sure that not only are we seeing the clinical trials being done in a way that is equitable for and across the ecosystem, but we're also seeing clinical trials and data being gathered in a symmetrical way. One of the biggest harms in pharmacoeconomics right now, and certainly pharmacovigilance, is around the equity of and the symmetry of data collected. And if you have a study of a pill, of a molecule, and the data is actually not really managing clinical trial participant usage of that pill. So effectively, a lot of clinical trials, as we saw in the Pittsburgh study in 2000, going back 22 years now, 30% of clinical trial participants just don't take the pill, 30% report taking it before they ever take it, and then 30% take it when they're actually taking it. And so one of the issues that causes is a lack of trust in medications in general, because by the time the real effects hit a population post FDA approval, it's 5 years down the road, and now we're seeing massive implications on the molecule and its effect on the human body. And we're only then beginning to understand it because the clinical trial data was not accurate. Addressing that is one of the world's foremost leaders in clinical trial adherence technologies, Joanne Walters, and talking with her is Greg Bauer, who heads up partnerships and alliances at HITLAB and is also a senior innovation fellow. Greg, thank you for joining us today. Joanne, thank you for joining us today. Greg, you are on mute, and I'm going to hand the virtual video camera and microphone over to Greg.
Okay. Thank you, Stan, and thanks, Joanne, for joining us today. I'm delighted that we can have this conversation. I know that, Joanne, you've been involved in these clinical trials and remote monitoring of participants in these trials for many years. Maybe before we get into our key discussion, can you maybe just tell everybody a little bit about IMC and the CertiScan platform that you're working with?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Greg. So you can hear me fine? I'm not speaking too loud?
We're good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks very much for the introduction, Stan, as well, into the medication adherence field in the world that we live in today. IMC is Information Mediary Corporation, and IMC has been the leader in understanding how patients take medication and tracking adherence for well over 2 decades. I have been blessed to have been part of that journey and have been working with IMC and many researchers across the globe for the last 17 years. As Greg had mentioned, we like to remain and think that we are forward thinkers when it comes to understanding technology and the digital pathway that we see coming through understanding how patients take medication. That involves a CertiScan platform, which actually is an adherence platform that helps researchers and research teams understand actually how people really do take medication. CertiScan is a platform that offers very powerful visualizations for research teams to understand the patterns of dosing and provides researchers actionable insights to help patients get on track to taking medication as prescribed.
Yeah, that's great. And so given that, I think you're going to be able to help us a great deal in some of what I'm kind of focusing in on. It turns out that the FDA released a new set of guidelines or guidance for clinical trials in April this year. It was called the Diversity Plans for Improving Enrollment of Participants from Underrepresented Racial and Ethnic Populations in Clinical Trial Governance or Guidance for the Industry. And so this guidance seeks to increase the number of racial and ethnic participants that have historically been underrepresented in clinical trials. And so the agency says its focus is really on on having a broader spectrum of Americans enrolled in trials, and it aligns with the Biden administration's goals of addressing inequities in healthcare. So when I look at that, I think about the FDA just having raised the bar for administering a clinical trial. A sponsor must not only meet its statistical endpoints and do so cost effectively and on time, but it now must accomplish this while recruiting a more diverse participant base, many of which may be very difficult to find, especially for the larger phase 3 trials. So this begs the question how a sponsor or a CRO manages participation or participant adherence, which of course, as you laid out and as Stan talked about, is ensuring that the costs don't go up and it reaches their points. So Joanne, first question I would have for you is, what are some of the specific challenges that a CRO would face in monitoring participants of a clinical trial, just as a baseline of discussion?
Well, that's quite a directive that the FDA is putting out. So it's nice to see that they're, forever trying to improve clinical trials and patient health outcomes. So that's a very key directive. So what happens is this, especially, US clinical trial teams always try to get the most diverse population with inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what we've seen over the past several years, and we have many studies that have done this, is you have these hybrid models basically that think of the patient engagement remotely and how better to serve those diversified and underserved populations. So they're really quite clever in doing ways where you can actually have technologies such as remote monitoring of medication, intelligent packaging, those sorts of products that are in the hands of patients. Currently, a lot of them will get mailed out or delivered by courier. So there's some sort of traceability level on that to get the patient the medicine that they do need. So with technology, what's happening is you can have medication packaging that actually can track each time a patient removes a pill. That data can be transcribed and pushed to a cloud through many different ways. But if you're serving underprivileged and underserved populations, you can actually have a hybrid where a care team can meet possibly halfway rather than a patient having to drive 3 hours or take a bus that might take them 5 hours to get to a clinic site. So it's basically extending the reach using digital health tools and also allowing mobility of product that can actually track real-time medication usage, which is what you're trying to do. You want to make sure the patient can take medicine and you want to make sure they take it as prescribed, right? So if you can do that remotely, you can actually reach an entire category of underserved and underprivileged populations. And I think that's a big key with digital health and remote monitoring, is you can extend what the FDA's directive is to serving the outreach that they need to help with the clinical trial results.
You raised an interesting point there also, Joanne, about traceability of the dose. I mean, part of the trial and some of the people in the trial, their responsibility is to make sure that down to the actual pill, they have clarity on where that pill went and where it was consumed, yes or no. I'm assuming that something like this remote monitoring would greatly ease the burden on someone who's trying to manage the logistics and the supply chain of the trial.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially when you bring in the clinical research organization, who are the direct contact with the patient, right? So you mentioned the cost of jumping from a phase 2 for a phase 3, which is a huge population increase, right? And each patient increased is a very dramatic cost to a clinical trial, right? So what'll happen is this. If you can actually keep an eye on your patients where they're engaged, and it's not a broad stroke approach where you are tracking patients like where there's beams coming from everywhere and this and that. It's a very simple experience where these intelligent packaging formats and solutions are really non-invasive to a patient. They just take pills as they normally would. There's nothing different, except there is a traceability step in there, which is critical to supply chain and also critical to having the CRO know that the patient is actually, hey, I'm really, you're doing really well. You're taking your pills as you should. And that broad stroke approach will see and point out that, as an example, an actionable insight, if a patient is dropping off their persistence of the treatment, a CRO can reach out at that point and say, what's going on? We want to keep you in the trial. Are you feeling okay? We see that, your medication is dropping down. How can we help you? So it obviously provides a nice tighter relationship between a CRO and a patient. And then patients feel empowered because they're like, oh my heavens, somebody actually cares. And I want to continue with the trial. And especially with underserved communities, there may be language barriers, there may be all sorts of potential obstacles that keep them from not wanting to go into a clinical trial. So if you can actually say, we're going to help you and kind of handhold you, I think that's a great step forward.
That's a really interesting point, because what you're raising is the concept of it's a team-based approach. It's and especially with trying to get to people who are more difficult to reach, it's got to be a collaborative effort between the sponsor, the CRO, even maybe the CMO, the manufacturing folks who are trying to get their distribution out to the patients. And the whole even patient education, patient literacy, engagement, all of that has to happen in order for the patient to adhere, I would imagine.
Yeah. So one very important thing that our data shows, over these decades, obviously we have a lot of fantastic data. We had what we see, the longer the treatment, as an example, in a 6-month, 4 studies, we saw that the adherence rate dropped off quite significantly. And these are important things, because what happens is when the persistence levels start to drop, patients aren't doing what they are supposed to per protocol. They don't necessarily feel well. So you're going to possibly lose those patients. And again, it comes back to enrollment and trying to maintain that enrollment number. We do see as well, if you can actually, adherence rates it is proven, and there's literature that shows self-report is typically, and recall bias is a little higher than, as an example, an intelligent electronic solution of packaging. So what'll happen is, if we could even increase adherence by 1%, which is really, not a lot to deal with, we could actually reduce the population size by 2% and still provide statistical significance. So if we could do that, when you jump from a phase 2 to phase 3, and the FDA directive is to try to keep that population as diverse as possible, the lesser the population numbers might be easier to get in that diversified, population group. So there's lots of ways that remote monitoring and smart packaging can actually help the sponsor, but as well as the patient health outcome, and basically follow these directives the FDA is putting out.
That's great. It's funny, as you were talking, we just got a comment about financial incentives aligned from one of our viewers. And I was going to ask you as my last kind of question before we turn it over to Stan, is there a rule of thumb that says, if you can, like you just said, 1% may reduce the overall cost by X amount to get your endpoints? Is there, especially in the area of trying to get participants engaged, is there a cost factor, like a ratio or a rule of thumb that people can look at around how remote monitoring can improve cost and effectiveness at all?
Well, I think the whole point of that is it's an enormous ROI through many different levels, right? So obviously the ROI can be per patient, you know, you spend $40,000-$50,000 on one patient. If you can reduce that size, jumping from a phase 2 for a phase 3, there's some numbers right there to throw. But also the important part is perhaps abandonment of a drug. When you actually, in your phase 2, you see this real-time, real-world data and you think, oh my heavens, this is really not, you know, we have to change something. The molecule's not being as we had intended. And then so you have those cost savings as well on the R&D side. But
Well, that's a
again,
good point.
getting
Yeah.
getting your drug to market faster with such evidence-based data will actually get your data hopefully to the FDA and approved much quicker. So you have a longer patent use life on that as well, right? But again, it's about
Yeah.
patient safety and dose optimization and all those good things about
Yeah.
medication adherence.
That's great. Those are some really terrific points. Joanne, thank you for joining us and for making that the clarity of some of those points. Stan, I think I turn it back over to you.
That is correct, sir. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Greg. Great session on medication
Thank you.
adherence and health equity. Thank you both.
Take care.
Just a lot of insights there. I mean, it really is amazing to listen to someone like Joanne Walters, who has been in the ecosystem now for a few decades and has really been one of the folks who has built the digital health ecosystem and the smart, this kind of medication adherence solution that goes beyond just the packaging and goes into the IT solutions, and truly one of the leaders around the world in that area.